International news now.
Okay, so in our news segment for today, we are going to talk about these two related stories that I brought up at the beginning of the class today. First, we are going to break down several key aspects of President Trump's speech to the United Nations that was delivered last week. And like I said, this was an important speech that was overshadowed in the news cycle by dramatic stories centered on domestic politics. These included a controversy over the possible resignation or firing of Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein after news organizations, the New York Times, reported that he was willing to wear a wire to record conversations with Donald Trump, and he also suggested in a meeting, or several meetings actually, about applying the 25th Amendment to possibly remove Donald Trump from power because of not being fit for office. And then, of course, there's also, and this has really dominated the news, the riveting story of accusations of sexual misconduct against Brett Kavanaugh, the nominee to fill the vacant seat on the Supreme Court. All of these things really dominated, and as they should. I mean, this is a historic time. But what we're going to do is talk about Donald Trump's speech at the UN, because it does deserve some extended discussion, especially in a course on U.S. foreign policy, because it has very important implications for a broad range of issues regarding U.S. relations with the rest of the world. So we're going to break down this speech. Now, this is the second time Donald Trump has given a major address to the United Nations, and both times his speeches to the United Nations have been newsworthy. In his first speech to the UN last year, Trump made news by personally attacking the president of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, calling him Rocket Man. I don't know if there was a little Rocket Man during the UN speech. I can't remember.
That was a later tweet.
Yeah. But, and he was threatening, and he really escalating the rhetoric with that speech, threatening to destroy the North Korean regime if Kim kept threatening the United States with nuclear weapon and ballistic missile tests. Now, this year, in this very same venue, the United Nations, Donald Trump took a very different tone with North Korea. He was highlighting the Singapore summit and the promise of further negotiations with Kim that could lead to denuclearization. And so he was quite friendly and complimentary to the very same person that a year ago at the United Nations he was sharply critical of. Now, Trump did have some very harsh words for Iran this time around. He criticized and really identified Iran as the source of a lot of the problems that the world faces, particularly in the Middle East. Now, we are not going to cover this aspect of his speech today. Mostly because we have already discussed the Iran nuclear deal, which was a centerpiece of his discussion about Iran, and America's withdrawal from that deal. So we've talked about that at length. Rather, we are going to emphasize some of the broader themes of this speech. And Trump's speech this year amounted to a major statement of his grand strategy, and articulated not just a set of policy proposals, although there were quite a few of those he introduced, but a spirited defense of his America First approach to U.S. foreign policy. And so this seems like, as I already said, the clearest clarification of how Donald Trump sees the world, what he sees as America's and the world's main threats and challenges, and how he plans to address and solve these problems. The tone of the speech was even different than we typically see from Donald Trump. It was delivered with a more measured and deliberate style, and it seemed more carefully constructed to provide a unifying theme built around the virtues of his approach to U.S. Foreign policy, the virtues of state sovereignty, and the idea that every state should pursue its own self-interest. Now, this speech covers a lot of ground, And we're not going to examine all of it. And we may return to parts of it later in the course, particularly as it touches on some of the issues that are directly relevant to this course, like immigration. There's a big section on that, for example. But today we're going to highlight the major themes that showcased this idea of a Trump worldview and how this view informs certain key policy proposals.
So we're going to start our discussion of Trump's speech at the beginning. And there was an incident at the very start of his speech that received a lot of media attention, not because of what Trump said as much as the reaction it received from the audience of world leaders and diplomats. In short, Trump made a bold claim about the successes of his administration in his first 2 years of office and was met by laughter. So let's go ahead and watch that short clip to show what we mean.
Today I stand before the United Nations General Assembly to share the extraordinary progress we've made. In less than 2 years, my administration has accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. America's so true. Didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
So as you can see, President Trump made a pretty grandiose claim about the success of his administration. He claimed that his administration, quote, accomplished more than almost any administration in the history of our country. This was met at first by a few chuckles until he doubled down, so true, and acknowledged—
So true.
So true,
You gotta
yes.
put the emphasis on it.
And acknowledged the laughter. And so let's make a couple of points here. First, late night talk show comedians and more serious commentators have made quite a bit of this reaction. And, you know, and I gotta say, so I just, at the same time, I wanna step back for a second. And nobody is talking about, did you hear about him at this rally, about what he said about Kim Jong-un? And so I was just looking at this quote.
I mean, he did like 3.
So rally on Saturday night in West Virginia, Trump revealed that he fell in love with the very man Republicans labeled a nut job and a lunatic just a few years ago. I was really being tough, and so was he, and we would go back and forth, and then we fell in love, okay? No, really. He wrote me beautiful letters, and they're great letters, and then we fell in love, right? So this is President Trump talking about Kim Jong-un. And I think the reason I'm bringing this up is because a lot of times in the news and the noise cycle, there was a ton made about the UN speech, really, the first 30 seconds of it and the laughter about it and what it meant. And then it drowns out a lot of other substantive stuff that's even more significant in this. This is an amazing thing for a president, I think, to say, to go from calling him Rocket Man, threatening nuclear war, and now all of a sudden to say publicly in a rally that he loves him. This is a complete reorientation of American policy to North Korea that's occurred just in the span of the last 8 or 9 months. And
we should make clear why that's the case. I mean, the North Korean regime is arguably the most notorious despotic regime in the world.
Yeah.
And ranks right up there with, you name your most notorious dictatorship. Kim Jong-un in North Korea is in there.
Yeah.
And so to so clearly and publicly embrace the leader of the North Korean regime, no matter what kind of deal you struck with it, is, different.
Yes. So let's come back to the speech here, and a lot of jokes were made about this, but let's think about what are some of the more significant implications and why are some people really concerned about this, right? So critics have argued that their reaction reflects a broader and significant decline in status and prestige for the United States. And so for these critics, that laughter means that world leaders no longer take the American president and his claims seriously because they are inaccurate, or worse, they're disconnected from reality. Now, second, of course, the Trump administration had a different interpretation. The crowd was not laughing at him, but they were laughing with him because he provided a moment of self-deprecating humor, right? When he says, didn't expect that reaction, but that's okay.
That's when the laughter really started, right?
And so just a matter of interpretation, perhaps, but we want to make a different point here by pointing out what immediately follows this exchange. So let's first run the clip of the rest of his introductory statement for the speech.
America's economy is booming like never before. Since my election, we've added $10 trillion in wealth, The stock market is at an all-time high in history, and jobless claims are at a 50-year low. African American, Hispanic American, and Asian American unemployment have all achieved their lowest levels ever recorded. We've added more than 4 million new jobs, including 500,000 manufacturing jobs. We have passed the biggest tax cuts and reforms in American history. We've started the construction of a major border wall, and we have greatly strengthened border security. We have secured record funding for our military, $700 billion this year, and $716 billion next year. Our military will soon be more powerful than it has ever been before. In other words, the United States is stronger, safer, and a richer country than it was when I assumed office less than 2 years ago. We are standing up for America and for the American people, and we are also standing up for the world. This is great news for our citizens and for peace-loving people everywhere. We believe that when nations respect the rights of their neighbors and defend the interests of their people, they can better work together to secure the blessings of safety, prosperity, and peace. Each of us here today is the emissary of a distinct culture, a rich history, and a people bound together by ties of memory, tradition, and the values that make our homelands like nowhere else on earth. That is why America will always choose independence and cooperation over global governance, control, and domination. I honor the right of every nation in this room to pursue its own customs, beliefs, and traditions. The United States will not tell you how to live or work or worship. We only ask that you honor our sovereignty in return.
So, I mean, really significant what he said there at the latter point in terms of the U.S. is going to try and convert the rest of the world. And it's significant in terms of the change in American foreign policy. And if you think about support for democracy promotion, that we can date back really to the middle of the 19th century. He's intentionally walking away from this. So this is a substantial reorientation in American foreign policy. But we want to make another large point here. Right? Donald Trump was serious about his view of his administration's successes. He finds them impressive. The American economy is booming with the stock market at historic highs and unemployment at historic lows. These are facts, right? And he emphasized the benefits of these for minority populations in the United States as well. Note the other successes he champions: tax cuts, a border wall, and reduced immigration, and sharp increases in military spending. For Trump, this equates to a United States that's stronger, safer, and a richer country than when he took over. He then goes on to describe how the United States achieved these economic and security successes. They were not a product of longer-term forces or a cumulative effect of years of U.S. global leadership of the system built after World War II. No, America is stronger now because of the change of course in American foreign policy that he initiated. America is now protecting its sovereignty more robustly and prioritizing its self-interests, as all countries should. Note, too, how he frames the choices facing the world. His approach, emphasizing state sovereignty, is aligned with independence and cooperation, while the other side of global governance brings about control and domination. Now, of course, we can debate all these assertions, but this is his case for his grand strategy.
And so what I find, really different about this speech than a lot of the other venues where you see Donald Trump speaking is that, you can hear some of these themes in a rally in West Virginia or have you, but, that's him playing to his base, right? And it's just a different environment, right? It's this place where he knows what they want and he gives it to them, and people don't really take it, especially skeptics, don't take it seriously. It's like, of course, build that wall and all the chants and everything else. It's not a serious intellectual case being made. This does have all the makings of a campaign speech, right? Like, this is what I've done right. But he's giving it at the United Nations in a very formal setting, in a very measured tone, where he says, look, this is where the United States is now compared to where it was just 2 years ago. And he's making a very direct and, for some, going to be a pretty compelling argument that we're better off now. And the reason we're better off isn't because of, legacy effects from the previous administration, but because we're doing things differently now. We're taking on bad trade deals. We're taking on, a system that has always disadvantaged the United States, and we're trying to correct those things. And so that's why we're breaking down the speech, because it really does get at the heart of the logic behind what all of these things he's doing. He's not doing this just on whims, really. I mean, this really, and because sometimes it seems like he is, right? He wakes up someday and says, I'm mad at China or whatever. But this does not suggest that. And that's why it's important to go over these things.
Let me just say one more thing about the data that he provides and what I phrased as facts. So yes, the American economy is doing better. Unemployment rates are lower. Stock market values are way up. But politicians are still, so we have those empirical facts, but we still have tons of disagreement over what caused them, right? And we're not weighing in here on the sources of these causes. He's saying, that these are the policies.
He's making a case.
Yeah.
That's not, the fact. That's just an argument. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's important to see this argument and the kind of, and I do think, especially in a class, you get a lot of jokes, right? We even make jokes. But you get it in the media all the time. You don't really take him very seriously sometimes. But this is the time to start dissecting this seriously. Like, okay, where does he have a point? Where does he not? What's the flaws of this kind of approach? And so now we're going to move on. So you've seen then from this speech the general statement of Trump's grand strategy. And so now we're going to start examining how he sees this emphasis on state sovereignty, right? And each country putting their own self-interest first, and how he sees it playing out in international relations. And we're going to do this by looking at a few other parts of Trump's speech and talk about how he sees it playing out in specific policies. And we're going to start with the part of Donald Trump's speech that talks about what he calls a new approach to the Middle East. And as you'll see, this new approach relies heavily on America's regional allies, carrying much more of the burden for establishing and maintaining security and order in the vital regions around the world like the Middle East, and the United States retreating from its traditional role as a hegemon that uses its military strength to establish order. So let's run that clip on that particular issue.
In the Middle East, our new approach is also yielding great strides and very historic change. Following my trip to Saudi Arabia last year, the Gulf countries opened a new center to target terrorist financing. They are enforcing new sanctions, working with us to identify and track terrorist networks, and taking more responsibility for fighting terrorism and extremism in their own region. The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar have pledged billions of dollars to aid the people of Syria and Yemen, and they are pursuing multiple avenues to ending Yemen's horrible, horrific civil war. Ultimately, it is up to the nations of the region to decide what kind of future they want for themselves and their children.
Okay, so let me make 3 points here. First, Trump's message on the Middle East here is that the United States will increasingly delegate more responsibility for regional crises like civil wars in Yemen to regional allies such as Saudi Arabia, right? And so we are kind of receding from that. Second, note the emphasis on burden sharing. Donald Trump always seems to go to that place and talk about the dollars and cents of military interventions and global security arrangements. And he highlights regularly that, the relative contribution of various actors in saying that the United States really can't bear be the only actor out there that bears the burden of and the costs of these interventions. So he highlights here the billions of dollars supplied by the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar for Syria and Yemen. And so under Trump, the signal here is that the U.S. is less willing to use its military abroad to battle terrorism or other threats. It will do it, but only as long as the United States is not paying the lion's share of the bill, right? So time and again during this speech and other places, Donald Trump highlights that the U.S. has been providing security for free to various countries around the world, and that it will no longer be doing that. And finally, and I would say quite importantly, Donald Trump ends this segment of his speech with a statement. He lays final responsibility for the fate of the Middle East on its regional actors. He says that ultimately it is up to the nations of the region to decide what type of future they want for themselves and their children. And this goes back to a point Professor McDonald made. This is a significant change from previous administrations. Under the Bush administration, the United States had ambitions to remake the Middle East by toppling Saddam Hussein and spreading democracy to Iraq. And we were the main drivers of this. It wasn't a regional effort, right? President Obama, he was more skeptical of nation-building endeavors, right? But still saw the United States as the indispensable nation that needed to provide security and other crucial public goods when no other actor would do so. It's under Donald Trump that the United States no longer seems willing to serve that role. So it's a key part of this whole overall strategy, I would say.
So President Trump applies the same worldview to global economic policy. And just as countries have taken advantage of American security guarantees over the years by not paying enough for their own security, they've also taken advantage of American open markets. So as we'll see, the remedy to this problem is the same as well. The United States needs to protect its own interests by forcing a renegotiation of the terms of trade with countries. And so let's start with a clip from Trump's speech that concentrates on trade.
We believe that trade must be fair and reciprocal. The United States will not be taken advantage of any longer. For decades, the United States opened its economy, the largest by far on earth, with few conditions. We allowed foreign goods from all over the world to flow freely across our borders. Yet, other countries did not grant us fair and reciprocal access to their markets in return. Even worse, some countries abused their openness to dump their products, subsidize their goods, target our industries, and manipulate their currencies to gain unfair advantage over our country. As a result, our trade deficit ballooned to nearly $800 billion a year. For this reason, we are systematically renegotiating broken and bad trade deals. Last month, we announced a groundbreaking U.S.-Mexico trade agreement. And just yesterday, I stood with President Moon to announce the successful completion of the brand new U.S.-Korea trade deal. and this is just the beginning. The United States lost over 3 million manufacturing jobs, nearly a quarter of all steel jobs, and 60,000 factories after China joined the WTO. And we have racked up $13 trillion in trade deficits over the last 2 decades. But those days are over. We will no longer tolerate such abuse. We will not allow our workers to be victimized, our companies to be cheated, and our wealth to be plundered and transferred. America will never apologize for protecting its citizens. The United States has just announced tariffs on another $200 billion in Chinese-made goods, for a total so far of $250 billion. I have great respect and affection for my friend, President Xi, but I have made clear our trade imbalance is just not acceptable. China's market distortions and the way they deal cannot be tolerated. As my administration has demonstrated, America will always act in our national interests.
So I want to make a few major points here. First, Trump offers a narrative on trade that reinforces his broader theme that the current status quo works to the disadvantage of the United States. It bears repeating that this status quo is the global economic system that the U.S. itself constructed after World War II. From Trump's perspective, however, the United States opened its market to the world, but many other countries in the world did not reciprocate. Therefore, the United States has been getting played as other countries took advantage of our open markets while retaining trade barriers and other unfair practices that provided their firms and workers with an unfair advantage over the American firm and American workers. Now, these unfair trading practices have resulted in large trade imbalances that have significantly harmed American economic growth, the profitability of American firms, and most importantly, the welfare of the American worker. It has meant that jobs, particularly manufacturing jobs, have left the United States as firms have relocated their production to other countries to take advantage of lower labor costs. So Trump's remedy is simple. The United States needs to and has begun to renegotiate bad trade deals that have hurt American workers. Now, Trump touts the renegotiated NAFTA that at the time of his speech only included the United States and Mexico, but now includes Canada as of Sunday. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. He also championed a new bilateral trade deal with South Korea. His speech clearly cast the current trade war with China in the same vein. Tariffs on China are part of the broader strategy, using pressure from tariffs to force a renegotiation of a better, fair trade relationship with China that lowers the trade imbalance and better serves U.S. interests. Now, again, one may challenge many of the assertions underlying this logic, but this speech has made the Trump administration's strategy regarding tariffs and trade policy quite clear.